Alright gang, welcome to Module 6. Now this should be a lighter week than previous when it comes to the amount of work you've got to do and the concepts that we're dealing with. Because a lot of these concepts we've talked about to a degree, or we performed some of these concepts. And in this module, it's about adding roles to Windows Server 2022. Now, we've already walked through and performed the task of adding Active Directory or Active Directory domain services to our server. So we've gone through that. And we also, if we chose to, went through and enabled DNS. Preferably we undid that when we got done, but that's a whole different battle when it comes to that static IP address that we've been dealing with. So what we're going to deal with in this module is IIs and PDS. Now IIS is Internet Information Services. Let's just cut to the chase of what IIS is. It's a web server. So when you think about a web server, something that hosts a website, in Microsoft terminology, that's IIS. If we're dealing with a print server, that's PDS. So we've got these two different roles that we're dealing with. We want to be able to implement different roles, and we've already walked through that, as I said, in some respects. We're not going to do anything with the virtual machines in this module. This will be like a break from our VMs this week. So in this module, we've got a couple of videos about remote access to a system, implementing web services or IIS, implementing file and print services, and the things associated with that. Maybe some permissions relative to files. So, with that said, we've got the different roles, and we have hit on that in the past. And we currently have ADDS, we've got file and storage. We shouldn't have DNS on our machine. It may be there, but we're not actually using it. All right, we'll just leave it at that. Servers come in different forms, and when we say we're going to implement a role for this server, in the past I've talked about it as we've got this device, this server, and it's performing work for us. And we outsource our work to these servers. Now the servers have certain tasks they need to perform, and it could be they manage the mail, they manage our websites, they keep track of all our documents, they manage security, who comes and goes and what they have access to. They manage facilities. There's things like that conceptually that apply to our servers. Now, when we implement these roles, the servers, in essence, have more software applied to them. Because when we turn something on, essentially what we're doing is we're saying, hey, we're going to add a role to what you're already doing, and now you're going to be doing this as well. And most of the time, it involves implementing or turning on software applications. Now, a lot of this is done automatically. I'll discuss some of it in the videos that I've got for you. Each application has a different port, usually more than one port, that it interacts with to be able to access or communicate on the network. So we're talking about, in this part, mail servers, and there are different protocols associated with handling mail, how we're going to transfer things. And essentially, if you think about it, if we went to go mail anything in the Postal Service or FedEx or UPS, whatever it may be, there are different rules that we've got to follow. The rules are, in IT, we call them protocols. So the rules that we've got to follow, depending on what we want to do, oh, you want to ship something that's hazardous, explosive, biological, whatever it may be, there's protocols associated with it. And they ask you, if you went to the post office and you went to go send a letter, they will ask you a list of questions, or will you attest that these things are not in your package? And sometimes it seems ridiculous, but let's say that I walked up, they saw me take an empty envelope and put a check in it, seal it, write the address of the recipient as well as mine on it, and they were going to put the postage on it, the stamp on it. So they saw what was there. They're still going to ask me questions associated with those protocols to ensure those protocols are adhered to. And that's what we've got to deal with when we're talking about a mail server or a web server, whatever it may be. There are rules, protocols that we have to follow. And depending on what it is that we're sharing, how we're communicating from one server to a client, or server to server, from one system to another, the task that we're performing will potentially use different protocols and ports associated with those protocols. Okay? So we got to know the rules to the game. That's it in a nutshell. So as we come down through, we said, look, we're going to implement this simple mail transfer protocol server as a role, and we'll move forward. And that's as simple as it is to add this role. And we've gone, like I said, we've gone through it already. We could have a variety of different roles. This scrolls way up, scrolls way down. As long as we know what's associated with the role, we have sufficient resources to perform these roles. What do you think about that? I don't want to attempt to perform a role unless I have the resources available to do it. It's logical. It can't get any more basic than that. But all too often we see people do it all the time. They say, yeah, I can do that job. They don't have the tools, they don't have the experience, they don't have the knowledge to be able to perform the task, and it does not go well. In IT, if you try to implement a role with insufficient resources, the system 99% of the time will stop and undo whatever you've tried to do. So we've got to know the requirements before we go down those paths. We could have a database server. That could be a role where we're sharing out files. We could have a monitoring server, and it just keeps track of what's taking place on the network. We have servers that their only role is different types of security and disaster recovery. Like I said, IIS is Microsoft's terminology for a web server. And we've got different protocols associated with it, primarily HTTP and HTTPS. Now, there is also a file transfer protocol, and I've got a video for that following this one. And when we're talking about a web server, essentially all it does is it serves out web pages. And web pages, in a nutshell, come in two forms. They're static or they're dynamic. If they're static, every time somebody comes to the page, it looks exactly the same. And that is fairly common on older websites. Newer web pages use what are called active server pages. Now, active server pages, the client and server interact with each other to build a dynamic page based on some user data. Could be your content and your cookies that says, here's what we need to serve out to this individual. Now, a good example of this is if you go to, let's say you go to Amazon.com and you have an account with them. Once they recognize that you have an account with them, you've logged in, whatever it may be, the pages become dynamic. They're not static. They are built specifically for you. Anybody else goes in, the likelihood of them getting the exact same page that you see is very slim, because it's being configured based on your past history, searches that you've done, things that you've bought, whatever it may be. So that's an active server page. The page is built on the server side, and then that is sent over to the client machine. As opposed to the static page that is pre-configured, the client requests it, they get it, and it just is generated by the browser. The active server page, the browser interacts back and forth with the server to dynamically create the page. Which one is more resource intensive? Well, the active server page is by far, because of the back and forth. So if we're going to have IIS, well, that's web server, IIS. We're going to have file and storage service. We're going to be a file server, maybe FTP. That's here. So like I said, some of these concepts we've dealt with in the past. Some of these are new. So I want you to go through, read the content here. I'm not going to read it to you. We're all grown. And like I said, we're not going to implement anything on the virtual machines in this module. It'll be coming up next week, the week after. So with that said, I will see you in the next module.